Hello, welcome to this edition of PM Express. My name is Martha Krensolapa, and today we are talking conflict resolution. And my guest is Joyce New, Dr. Joyce New, a conflict resolution expert. She has so much experience, I don't know where to start from, but we can get into the conversation right away, and I'm sure you're going to learn one or two things to resolve your conflicts even at home. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Welcome to Ghana too.
Thank you.
How difficult is it to resolve conflicts?
It depends on the conflict. Some conflicts can be resolved in one afternoon, and some conflicts can be resolved in a span of a decade. Very sadly, we've seen in some of the major conflicts in the world, they take time to resolve.
Why does it take time?
It takes time because if there's violence going on at the time, then it's very hard for the parties to agree to put down their weapons if they're not sure that the agreement they're going to get is going to be sustainable, that they don't maybe have trust that the other sides, and usually there are more than two sides in any conflict, they're not sure that they can trust the other sides to live up to the terms of the agreement. So until they have a little more confidence building that has happened, they're not going to be ready to just put down their arms and go home. So that's one of the reasons.
So we were having a conversation earlier, you were telling me it's difficult when lives have been lost already. Explain that bit.
Exactly. So if you have a dispute with your neighbor and can't sleep because they turn on their music too loudly and it bothers you, nobody has actually been endangered because of that. It's inconvenient and it's not pleasant, but one can come to some agreement without losing face or without creating problems. On the other hand, when there has been massive violence, it's very difficult for the parties to agree to stop the violence, because if lives have been lost, how do these leaders then rationalize the loss of life to the parents and the husbands and the wives and the children of those who've died in support of the cause that these same leaders have urged them to fight for? So it makes it very difficult for them to be able to say enough is enough, we need to stop the fighting, because they understand how much people have suffered as a result of their urging them to take up arms.
I see. So there are actually stages of conflict.
Yes.
So it's easy to resolve it at the beginning.
Yes.
When it escalates and it goes further, then it becomes difficult or almost impossible to solve it. So what will make you see that this conflict is going to be resolved in a day, one afternoon, or it will take a decade to resolve it?
It's hard to know for sure, but of course the best possible thing is to prevent the conflict to begin with. And so what many of us work for is conflict prevention. And that is really doing a diagnosis of the situation in a country. If you think the country is going through some difficult times, or might be, you try to figure out what's going on, and then you try to interact with the actors to begin with. And this is usually done by people in the country themselves, not by outsiders.
Okay.
It's often done by civil society organizations who can see that people are getting edgy and not feeling very comfortable. So often people within the country start talking to the leadership, start talking to the religious leaders, and trying to mobilize to prevent violence from happening. Mm-hmm. But when violence does occur, so going back to the question of how easy it is to resolve, it's always easier to resolve a conflict that has not caused a loss of life or that has not caused great injury. That makes it simpler to begin with, as is easily understood. But once you've started having lives lost, and the longer the conflict goes on, it is often the case that parties themselves, the warring factions, start splintering.
Okay.
So you might start with two groups. Yeah, you might start with two groups. And then one of the groups has a battle for power within the group. They splinter off. Then you may have an outside actor come in who you didn't even know had a problem. They might join in. And so it's very difficult to figure out who you have to deal with. I mean, it becomes very complicated. Who do you deal with? Who do you deal with first? If you have people who are fighting, who are considered terrorists, then it's very hard to know how to deal with them. Do you actually dignify them and bring them to the table? And usually the answer is no, you don't do it that way. Then you have to have another process. And so then it becomes much more complicated and it takes a lot more time.
Okay, so when it starts, it's better, okay, it's better to prevent it. But
Absolutely.
when it starts, it's better you resolve it quickly.
Yes.
But I was asking earlier about trust issues.
Yes.
At the table, you go to the negotiating table, you're talking to them, you are the mediator. It gets to the point they don't trust you, or?
That can happen. I mean, you know, first thing is, the optimal way to resolve a conflict is if the parties deal with each other directly in negotiations. Okay. So if they can have direct talks, that means there's enough trust directly between the parties that they can still talk to each other. And this is very much what families do. If you have an argument with your spouse or with your children, you don't bring in the neighbor to solve the problem, unless it's really bad. And in that case, you have perhaps local peace councils, you have different systems in different societies that can help resolve community disputes. But normally you resolve things directly, face to face, and that's the best solution. But if you have to bring in a mediator, the mediator may be from within the society, it might be someone in the country, in the community, or it could be someone from outside, international, and that's more my experience is as an international mediator. And their people may or may not trust you. In any case, they may or may not trust you. If they do not trust you to begin with, then you are not the right person to be doing this, to begin with. And that's the first thing that has to be established, is do they trust that you are impartial? Do they trust that you will listen to them and that you understand enough about the situation that they can trust you? Because if you arrive and you say, I'm in Accra. Where's Accra? I don't know. Tamale. I've never heard of that. What is tamale? Well, then you're not going to work in Ghana because you have no credibility. So as a mediator, you have to do your homework. And that's part of gaining the trust of the parties, is having the knowledge.
What would go into your homework?
Yes. What would go into doing your homework?
Yes.
You have to know the chronology of the conflict. You have to try to figure out what are the root causes. Because the fighting is a symptom, but it's not the cause. Okay. You don't take up arms because you want to. You take up arms because there's a grievance. And that's why you do. So you have to figure out what are these underlying grievances and who is involved. Who are the people who have been triggers for this? And then what fuels the conflict? Where's the money coming from? Who's funding this? Is the money coming from the diaspora? Where is the money coming from to fund this war? Because wars are not self-sustaining. I mean, they have to have money. So you do your homework and know. You also need to know who are the friends of each of the parties. It is sometimes the case that an external actor, a country, is actually supporting one of the parties or another. This happens very frequently. Because it's in the interest of that country, it's in their own national interest to support one particular side or another. So you need to know who these are, because you also need to be able to speak with them and find out what it's going to take for them to stop that support.
Okay. I was asking about the trust issue because
Yes.
recently we had a local issue with a labor expert who is at the table with the labor unions, government, and he's supposed to be negotiating, helping them, mediating, so we can solve this series of strikes and
Yes.
going to court and all that. And one group comes up to say he is not trustworthy. They can't trust him, they can't work with him, they are sure he's working in the interest of one party.
Well, it's a good question, because sometimes if the parties truly do not trust the mediator, then the mediator needs to assess that and perhaps offer to step down. One of the ways that you know whether the parties are serious or not about distrusting the mediator is if the mediator actually asks to step down and says to the parties, it looks like you don't have faith in me at this point, so I will therefore step out of this mediation. The parties will frequently say, no, stay. And that's when you know that what's happening is that the parties are using the mediator to diffuse the tension, and they're blaming the mediator. But in fact, it's not that they don't trust the mediator. It's just a way to express their anger and or their tension with the other party.
Okay.
And in some ways, to actually link with the other party in their dislike, supposed dislike for the mediator. So they both share, in a way, the distrust. And by that way, they're kind of partnering with each other against the mediator, which is not necessarily a bad thing.
Have you experienced that before?
I have experienced not exactly that, but I've experienced a situation where, because of being the only woman in the room, one of the members of my own team thought that the parties might be more comfortable with a male mediator. And so I very tactfully and privately went to the heads of each delegation and asked them if they would prefer, you know, I said I'd be happy to step out and to have this other gentleman on my team lead the mediation. And actually, one of the reactions was quite astonishing. One of the reactions was, "We're sorry we've offended you." And I said, "You've not offended me. I just thought you might be more comfortable having this gentleman lead the mediation." Okay, and his response was, "Well, we must have offended you, because otherwise we don't understand why you would do this." So I said, "No, we're fine then, thank you," and I continued.
And it was good it came from you?
Yes, I think it was good that it came from me, that I offered to do this, because it also reconfirmed their commitment to the process. So that at that point they could not easily say, "Okay, well now we're leaving because we suddenly don't like Joyce anymore."
In the sub-region, in Africa, West Africa sub-region, we've seen some uprising, we've seen some conflicts, and we're not sure, especially when it's in Cote d'Ivoire and it's gone to Togo, and we're in Ghana. There are some fears that it's likely to spill over to Ghana.
Yes.
How do we prevent this from escalating and spilling over to Ghana?
That's a very difficult question, and it's a real situation, because we've seen the spillover in this area with Sierra Leone and Liberia in the past, and Cote d'Ivoire to some extent, although not so much. Some spillover is very difficult to prevent in the sense of refugee flows and people who are fleeing. In terms of the actual conflict, there needs to be a match that can be lit.
Okay.
And in Ghana, so far, very fortunately, you have an active civil society, and you have some good governance here that seems to be able to maintain a peaceful environment. So the hope is that if there were any spillover, it would be rejected.
So we shouldn't have any fears, or we should start working towards
Absolutely.
and not getting to Ghana.
Absolutely. This is part of conflict prevention. It's active. It is not just thinking, let's not do anything. It's very active, and it has to do with educating children in the schools. What do you do if somebody comes and antagonizes you? How do you handle that? You mobilize communities. You support community reconciliation processes. You support local peace councils in doing more public education. You come out with different kinds of publicity, of media, where you're focusing on Ghana as a unified country, where people are all citizens, and where you do not just turn against your neighbor from one day to the next. So it has to be an active process of peace building.
Anyway, we like thinking it will never get to us until perhaps it gets to us, but we'll take a break from here, and when we come back, we'll talk about women's participation in conflict resolution, which Joyce is very passionate about. We'll be back. All right, thank you for staying with us this PM Express. We're still talking with Joyce, Dr. Joyce No here, and we're going to talk about gender and mediation, one of his many passions.
Yes.
One of her many passions, forgive me. So Joyce, I know you're very passionate about that. Is it because you're a woman?
I think a good part of it is because I'm a woman, and a good part of it is because in my experience in mediation, I'm usually one of no other women, or one of just a few other women. So it's very lonely in the sense of being in a room full of men in suits who do not seem to raise issues that address half of the population of their country. So it becomes very difficult when the men are negotiating or talking about issues that relate to distribution of ministerial positions, distribution of resources, but they're not actually addressing what are we going to do when the combatants go back to the communities. And women are the ones who've been in the communities during conflict. They're the ones who have suddenly taken on roles they never had before, where they've become the heads of family by necessity. They've had to earn a living. They know the economy of their family and the entire community. They know how things survive, how they survive. And when the war ends, they're suddenly in a position where they're relegated back to the traditional role, whatever that is in whichever society, and yet they have a tremendous amount to contribute to making the peace and to any peace agreement because of things like, if the combatants come back, who's going to make sure they don't have arms? Often it's the women who help disarm them. Who is going to guarantee the safety of the children going to school? Often, again, it is the women in the community in a very informal manner who create safe corridors so that the kids can get to school without anybody bothering them. So they deserve a place at the peace table because they have insights and knowledge from the war that largely the fighting forces don't have. And the fighting forces are fighting forces. They're not necessarily trained in how to make peace. And so only having the fighting forces at the table means that the people you have who are trying to make peace really don't have any experience with making peace. It's not their background. And yet, for the women who have been bridging the divide between the conflict parties, because they've been going between communities to make sure that they've got food, and sometimes they have to negotiate with people they may not like, but they've had to do it in order to survive. So you need their voices at the table, and you need women, more women on the parties, at the table, and as mediators. And you need that at the international level, at the national level, and at the local level.
But why is it so difficult? Is someone preventing the woman from getting there, or the woman herself is not feeling up to the task to do it?
I think it's a bit of both, although women do feel up to the task in doing it at the community level, because they're doing it. The problem is it's invisible.
Okay.
The work that women do is often invisible because it's not paid. And because they do it because they have to do it. It's not a job. Whereas the men tend to do it as part of their work, and they tend to be compensated for it. And so it is known, and that's part of their identity of what they do. So women at the professional level are many fewer. And sometimes women don't have the mentorship because there aren't women above them who are mentoring them. And men will mentor women as well, but more frequently men mentor other men.
Yes.
There are many wonderful men who do mentor women, but so far not enough. And we had the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which stipulates that women have to be part of every phase of a peace process. And that passed in 2000. We are now 14 years later, and we have made some progress, not a lot, but you might be interested to know that of all the peacekeeping missions going on in the UN, and I forgot exactly how many there are, but 38% of those missions are actually led, the top official is a woman, in a military peacekeeping mission in the UN. So that's progress, but we have a long way to go.
Yes. So what are you doing? I know you have to mentor some women. Are you mentoring someone or a group now?
You know, I try to mentor young men and women, but with more of a focus on women. And I try to advise, and I get emails and mostly emails from people I've never met who are just curious about what does a career path look like in this field. And I'm a very bad example of that because my career path has had so many detours. I have not gone from point A to point B. I've gone from point A to point F, and then from F to Z, and then back to B. And that tends to be more of a female, I hate to say, route than a direct route. Okay. But I do try to mentor people. I would like to see more women
So when you tell them that
they
don't come back?
They do come back. I stay in touch with many of these people for 20 years or more. So I'm still in touch with students and interns I've had from the 1980s and 90s. Yeah. Okay. And I'm very proud that many of them have done very well with very little. I take very little responsibility for their success, but I'm very happy for it.
Okay, so one of the major wars we've had in Africa is the Liberia war.
Yes.
What role did the Liberian woman, play in resolving that conflict?
Well, as we were talking about a little earlier, in fact, the Liberian women played a very important role, and the women who played such an important role were not the elites. These were everyday women. They were social workers. They were the market women, everybody. And they banded together because they were fed up with the war. Okay. And they started protesting. In the middle of the war zone, they started protesting right on the path that President Taylor had to take every day. And finally, they got a meeting with him, and they pushed him to go to the peace talks. They essentially somewhat shamed him into going into the peace talks, which he did not want to do. Once the peace talks started, the women got themselves to Ghana, where the peace talks were taking place, and they managed to raise some money. And they brought women to the peace talks. And when the peace talks were breaking down, the women barricaded the peace hall. Okay. And would not let the men out. And they said, until you solve this, right now you're staying in nice hotels, you're getting per diems, and you're not serious about peace. But the war is going on right now. More people are being killed, so you get serious fast, because we're not letting you out of the building.
That's good.
What happened with that, it was very good, because what it meant was the mediator actually was pleased with the women's movement, with what they were doing, because it helped him apply pressure to the parties to be serious. So women often are allies of the mediation. Women are friends of the mediator because they don't want the war to continue. They want the mediator to be successful. Okay. So they support him. And these are women from civil society, everyday women. One of those women, Lema Bowie, won the Nobel Peace Prize. So women have a lot of power, but they may not know it.
Until they put it to use?
Until they put it to use, and then they're very powerful.
Okay, so is conflict good for our homes? Conflict in the home?
Conflict is a very positive part of life. Okay. We have conflicts within ourselves, with our families. We have conflicts all the time. And generally speaking, they're productive. If you have a conflict, you deal with it and you move forward. Okay. When conflict becomes violent, it is never productive, and it is never useful when it's violent. But conflict is a fact of life, and it isn't by itself harmful. It is harmful only when it becomes either psychologically or physically abusive and violent. So in the home, I think it's good for people to learn how to deal with differences. We don't always agree with each other. It's good to know that, and it's good to model behavior to children which says, yes, I don't agree with you, but I don't have to be nasty to you. We can talk about it. I think that's a good way to handle conflict.
Okay. Currently, we have, it's been going on for a while, but there's this conflict in the Volta region, the Volta part of the country, where two towns are fighting over a piece of land. Yes. Now, currently there's a curfew imposed on that area, whenever they try settling it, it goes off because along the way, someone will go into the other part of the town and go shoot down someone in the farm. So it's Alavanyo and Nkunya. Every time they do that, then the conflict starts all over again. So whatever efforts government has put in resolving it goes to waste. Then we start from scratch. So I was talking to a colleague and he said, this thing will never end. And I was wondering, which conflict never ends? This is dispute over land. How would you advise that it's resolved?
Well, it's, as I was mentioning earlier, it seems like this should be resolved by people within the community, applying pressure to the parties, applying pressure to whoever the leadership is to get this to stop. There are usually some cultural or religious leaders. Anybody in the community who is influential, who people listen to, needs to come forward and needs to talk about what is right and what is not right. Now, it may be right, according to each side, that the land belongs to them. They may each feel that this is our land and we have a right to it. But it should not be a zero-sum game. It shouldn't be either or. There may be a way to split the land. Not to split it in half physically, but to split the use of the land. It may be that the argument is over, you know, whether we can allow our animals to graze here or whether we want to farm here. So there may be ways to figure out how we share this land in a way that meets both of our needs. So they need to sit down and talk about what is exactly do we want this land for. And I apologize, but I'm not familiar with the case, so they may have already done that. But the concern is, for what reason are you fighting over this land? You know, is it ancestral land? Are they burial grounds? I mean, what is the issue? Farming, grazing? But usually, if people will sit down and actually start to talk, but at the you do need the influence leaders who can convince others that this is not the right path to go on.
Why is it difficult for the leaders to talk and the people at the lower level not listen? Why is it difficult? Because in this case, when you go to them, the leaders tell you, we don't know anything about what is going on. And so it's just one person from my side who might have gone to the other side to kill someone there in the farm or to hurt someone in the farm. And they are faceless people. You can't tell who did it. And so whenever it happens to side A, then you know side B knows about it. I am sure he came from that side to inflict that pain on my people. So reprisal attacks and all that. Why is it difficult for the chiefs or the leadership of the community, as you are suggesting, to hold their people together so they don't even start it at all?
Well, sometimes the leaders may not be aware of it, but other people are. It's hard to believe in smaller communities that people don't know what's going on. I mean, I don't know if this is true in Ghana, but in most small communities, someone knows who's doing what. So somebody knows what's happening. And in that case, having a community meeting, I mean, one of the things that the leaders can do is to bring the people together and say, what is going on in our community? Is this what we want? Do we want to continue having these reprisal killings? So if you know who's doing what, we need to talk about it and find a way to address this, because we need to stop having our people killed because of someone in our group who's acting badly. So part of it would be having consultations within the community, and someone needs to take the lead in that. Now, it may be the women who do that. It may not be the men.
You recommend a woman do that? The women in the community to do that?
I think
they are the most affected when it comes to conflicts.
And I think they get fed up much more quickly. And I think that their tolerance for violence seems to be, I mean, this is a stereotype, but seems to be lower in the sense of seeing how many women in conflict actually do start bridging the divide much more quickly than the men. So it may be that women need to start taking a lead. And if there are women, especially older women who may be viewed as mothers and trusted, then perhaps they should start getting together across these two communities and going into each other's communities and talking about it and seeing what they can do.
Sort of appealing to the other side?
Yes, but forming actually a team across these two communities, having a group that consists of both communities to argue for peace and for a cessation of these attacks.
So finally in this segment, I want you to separate conflicts and then from crime. Sometimes in the midst of the conflict, people hide and then they commit crimes.
Absolutely.
How do you deal with them separately?
Yeah, you make an excellent point, and this is very difficult because criminals take advantage of political violence to commit more crimes. And you need to have a justice system. You need to have rule of law. And so these people need to be prosecuted. How do you make the distinction? Not always easy, but part of it has to do with personal gain. So if people are stealing things to take for themselves, that's theft. I'm not sure that's a political act.
No.
So I think at that point you really need whatever system of justice you have to take effect and to go into high gear and prosecute these people in whatever way is used in that community or society.
All right, so we'll take another break here, and when we come back, we'll talk about social media and its impact on conflicts. Thank you for staying with us. We still have Joyce Neal with us, and we're talking conflict management and resolution. You have been doing this for over 20 years.
Yes.
How did social media change the face of conflict resolution?
Social media has had a big impact. Media in general plays a very important role in any peace process. Okay. The parties always like to go and talk to the media and make extreme statements that can exacerbate the conflict and get them in intractable positions so that they can't back down. But as long as it was the traditional media, the newspaper, the television, it was not great. It was still very difficult because once parties have made these outlandish statements, it's very hard for them to retract. But now we have social media, which means while you are in the room talking to the parties, while they are talking, they're tweeting or they're texting. So as the peace process is going on, it's almost like a football game. And they're just busy texting every single move everybody's making, which means then that they are also getting advice from all these other people. Whoever they are sending notes to are probably writing them back and saying, no, you can't agree to that. Don't do that. You can't do that. So it makes it very difficult because instead of having 10, 20 people in the room, you might have 1,000 or 10,000 or 1,000,000 people in the room. So it's quite difficult. It's something that it's also difficult because with traditional media, you have the possibility as a mediator to actually discuss what your media strategy will be. As you start the talks, one of the first things would be, how would you like to handle the media? Because if these are high-level talks, you will have attention from the news media. And so you have to decide, are the parties going to go make statements after each round of talks? Are they going to be quiet? Do they want the mediation team to speak for them? So how will this work? And generally, often my experience has been that the parties actually want the mediator to speak to the press, and they don't want to because they know that they will have a tendency to say something inflammatory that they then can't back down on. But now again, with the social media, Facebook and everything else, they're out there and they're on the line and they're making commitments that perhaps in a week or two or a month, they're going to have to go against. And then it makes them lose credibility with their constituents. So it has added another dimension to mediation. And mediation was complicated enough before this. It's already like juggling, keeping 20 balls going at a time. It's already quite complicated. And then adding this thing where people are talking to all these other people who are not in the room and telling them blow by blow what's going on, just increases the complexity.
So how would you deal with something like that, a situation like that?
I think what you would deal with again is you would try to get agreement from the parties of how you're going to handle this. And so one of the things would be to agree that telephones don't go in the room. Okay. I don't know whether that could be agreed or not, but I think that would be one thing that would help a good deal. Or just to shut down, if possible, the Wi-Fi system or be someplace where you don't have cellular connection. But I think optimally you would get an agreement that your smartphones and everything would just be left outside for the time being. If the parties agree, the mediator cannot impose these things. It's not up to the mediator to be a dictator. It's up to the mediator to try to do what the parties want, but to also get to an agreement.
Why is it difficult for the mediator to allow, the groups to allow the mediator to call the shots? Because it is assumed you are the expert. You know what's good for the group. Or is it a matter of trust? They don't trust you take a decision in their interest?
Yes and no. You know, when you have a mediation in a conflict, then generally, as I said, it's a relatively high-profile event. So sometimes the parties don't want to be seen to be, you know, the little boys next to this big chief, you know? So they're going to have to show their feathers, so to speak, and assert themselves in some way. And that may be, again, to be angry at the mediator or to say we didn't agree to that, when in fact they did. But for public consumption, they're going to position themselves in a way that they are not subservient to anyone, which is, of course, I think, completely fine. It does not mean that they don't trust the mediator until such time as they start opting out of the mediation. There's nothing, mediation is not legal, it is not binding. There is, you know, you can sign an agreement with a mediation, but there's no legal, nothing holding you to it. It's mainly your will and that you want to do it, but you're not going to go to prison if you do not abide by a peace agreement. So it has to be voluntary, and the mediation has to be voluntary, and the mediator has to know when he or she has lost the trust of the parties, and if that happens, then they step out.
They step out of it. Okay, do you foresee conflict starting from social media becoming difficult to resolve, or you can resolve it like any other? The conflicts that starts from social media, because social media is everywhere. It's with us. We can't deny it's with us now. So I foresee some conflicts starting from there, but do you foresee that happening?
Oh yes, I think it happens all the time where people make inflammatory statements in social media, and then it starts a flurry of more messages. Now, if that's all that happens, then I don't think we have an issue, because as long as people have inflammatory language, it's not good. Now, I mean, it's not good, and it can be very harmful in terms of discrimination against people. I mean, it can be quite harmful, but it's not violent. I mean, usually it does not. If people are doing what they did in Rwanda, where they're targeting specific people on social media, saying, "I saw that family going down the street, go kill them," that's a completely different issue.
Yes.
That is, you know, seriously, that's a crime.
So how do you deal with that? Do you trace it to the roots who started it? It would be difficult
I suppose you would do the same thing.
Because I know it will go wild at a point, so it will be difficult to find out where it started from. And so how would you resolve that? Are you going to deal with the symptoms instead of the disease itself?
Yes, I mean, that is difficult to solve unless you can track, and sometimes you are able to track the IP address of a computer and you can find out who did it. But the same thing with, if you look at what happened in Rwanda, is the hate radio people got tried for war crimes. I mean, it's considered a crime against humanity, a war crime, and inciting genocide. So this is something that is prosecutable by law. Certain behaviors, you know, you are held to account with the International Criminal Court. So, so if people were actually inciting this kind of violence, then they could be prosecuted, but the whole thing is how fast are you going to find them and do something.
Okay, still talking about the media, not just social media. How would you want the media to deal with the issues of women so that they don't, they enhance the role of women in getting solutions to problems instead of making them look like women again? How do you expect the media to deal with that?
Well, the media has a responsibility to look at who they're talking to and who they're reporting on. And if you're reporting on a fashion person or somebody on a movie star, then there's a different kind of frame that you would have to speak about that person than you would for a professional or someone else. So, for example, I noticed in Kenya, in the talks in Kenya, Martha Karua, for example, was the head of the government delegation. And she was referred to as Martha. Now, the other members of the team were referred to as the honorable this, the honorable that. So one of the ways is to give the same respect to people in the same position and not discriminate according to gender. The media needs to pay attention to that and not buy into that. And the media also needs to pay attention to what women are saying and doing and not necessarily what they're wearing that day. So instead of saying Martha was wearing a lovely black dress as she interviewed her guest, you talk about what the interview is about. So that's part of the media's responsibility is not to focus so much on the stereotypical characteristics of either male or female, and to focus on why is it they're interviewing them? Why would you be talking to this person? So that's the focus, not on what they look like or.
Is it a cultural thing that is difficult to look beyond the woman and listen to the woman?
Perhaps sometimes. Sometimes I think it's assumed that women may not have the gravitas, may not have the seriousness or the experience that men have. I think that's changing. I hope it's changing. I see much more in the younger generation where young women professionals coming up, such as you, do have more, a little more influence and credibility than some of us had a number of years ago, where I used to get patted on my head by my male colleagues as a university professor. I don't think that happens anymore, hopefully. So I think it's changing slowly, but in every society, there are issues with gender, which is one of the reasons why you can't exclude half the population when you are dealing with serious issues that affect the entire population.
Okay, so for now, we're going to resolve our conflicts. We're going to work towards having a sane world, but in doing that, what are the 5 key things, if you have any 3, 2, 1, 5 key things we should look out for to prevent us going there, so that we'll even have to work towards resolution?
Yes. I think one of the things that's very important is to recognize the power and the influence of people in the communities and not rely on the leadership.
Okay.
Not to rely, the national leadership is wonderful, and they are the elected people who are supposed to govern the people. But it is the people who are the ones who hire those people, so to speak. It is the people who are paying the taxes and who are in power. So it's important that the people at all levels have some sense of organization, of watchdog groups, of associations where they can come together and discuss the issues in their own communities, where they can all get a hearing. People need to be heard when they have issues. They need to have a forum in which they can address those issues in a peaceful, nonviolent manner. So this is one thing I think that's very important, is the grassroots level having a voice. Another thing I think that's very important is citizen education and awareness. If you have citizens who are not educated, you have a problem. Because youth can easily be mobilized when they don't really know what's going on, or they don't really know who's doing what on what side, and they can be, like any of us, they can be manipulated if they see something is not good, and they're told that, well, by doing this you'll help, when in fact they won't be. So youth have to be educated enough to know that how to make decisions, how to do critical thinking, so that they themselves can make decisions that are intelligent decisions and that are for peace. Okay. And that raises another thing, which is peace is not something most of us know how to do too well. We all have arguments, we all fight with each other, and we're not always really great at resolving everything. Sometimes it just resolves because we get tired of it, and we decide to avoid the problem. So part of it also is an active campaign, which the media could help with, which local governments could help with, in promoting peaceful meetings in schools to talk about how do you deal with conflict. So really a peace education program. And the peace councils that I understand exist
Yes,
here,
yes.
and the Queen Mothers Association. And these are all organizations that are critically important for the prevention of violence. And Ghana seems to have a good head start on that. And I think, so that's part of the safeguard, but you also have to have an aware populace. You can't have people who say they don't care.
Thank you very much. We've been talking to Dr. Joyce New on this special edition of PM Express, and she's been telling us about how to resolve conflicts. Basic. She has given us some keys. We're going to take them and make sure we have a safe place to call our country. Thank you for staying with us.